Welcome to the psychedelic edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder to support the transmission. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year or more. If you'd like to put in a further amount, we do private weekly group Zoom chats to shoot the breeze on current events. I also compile a weekly newsletter of my commentary on the week's headlines, and sometimes we bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A with them. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, and other options, which are on the website, geopoliticsandempire.com. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me. And our sponsor this month is Mikhail Thorup's Expat Money Summit. It's a free online summit taking place in October from the 7th to the 11th. You do need to register for that summit. The link is in the description. And if you can't catch the free 24-hour replay, you can purchase the VIP upgrade. And if you use the promo Empire, you'll get $100 off. I'll be participating in one of the VIP panels on World War III, and the summit covers internationalization, getting a second, third, or fourth residency or passport, purchasing real estate, offshore banking, and all that sort of stuff. And check out my affiliates and leave a podcast review if you haven't. Why did I say it's a psychedelic edition of Geopolitics and Empire? Because joining us is Paul F. Austin, who's one of the most prominent voices in the world of psychedelics. As the founder of Third Wave, he has educated millions on the importance of safe and effective psychedelic experiences, a pioneer at the intersection of microdosing, personal transformation, and professional success. He's been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and the BBC's Worklife. He helps others use microdosing as a tool for professional development and increased self-awareness by treating the use of psychedelics as a skill refined through mentorship and courage exploration. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Paul.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here.
So, this is a bit out of the ordinary for Geopolitics and Empire, but I thought, let's look at this. And, it's not unrelated, because in the alternative media space, I've attended a number of conferences. I've got colleagues that are into this stuff, and I'm sure some listeners, I picked up this ayahuasca microdose earlier this year at a conference, alternative media conference, the Greater Reset. And so I thought, some of your stuff is interesting. And maybe to start, you write in your book, which I just finished reading, quote, "There have been three distinct periods when we've utilized psychedelics as integral tools for healing, transcendence, and transformation. I call these periods waves. The first wave orients around the ancient use of these sacraments. The second wave came about with the countercultural movement in the 50s and 60s. The third wave, as you will detail later in your book, you say, is now," end quote. So where do we begin, Paul? What is going on? Tell us about your work and mission.
So there's a really well-known futurist whose name was Alvin Toffler. And Alvin was best known for writing a book called Future Shock. He also wrote a book called The Third Wave, which was published in 1980. And in that book, Toffler talks about these three distinct waves: the agricultural age, the industrial age, and the information age. And he outlines how we've gone between these three waves and why we are in this third wave today. Now, I did not know about this book until about a year after I started Third Wave as an educational platform. And my story goes back, as you read about in the book, to Michigan. I was raised in a pretty sheltered traditional family. Found my way to psychedelics at the age of 19, had really profound and transcendent experiences. And about 5 years after that, in 2015, I started a educational platform called Third Wave to inform people about the pros and cons of psychedelics. And as I started to dive into the growth of psychedelics, I came to realize that the three waves of psychedelics map onto these three waves that Toffler so well articulated in his book, The Third Wave, that ancient agricultural societies from, from ancient India, written about in the Vedantic scriptures, to ancient Greece and the Eleusinian mysteries that Plato, Aristotle, and Marcus Aurelius participated in, to ancient Mexico, where peyote was very widespread. There is a clear and distinct relationship in ancient societies between psychedelics and particularly the elite of those societies, that many of the philosophers and priests and thinkers of these elite ancient societies were actively working with psychedelics. Now, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, these Eleusinian mysteries were banned. They were prohibited. And it wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s when psychedelics started to enter Western consciousness back once again through the invention of LSD. And so the first wave is, of course, the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelics. The second wave then is the countercultural use, particularly of LSD, but also of psilocybin mushrooms. And the way that I define the third wave is what is the bridge between the ancient rituals that have surrounded psychedelics for thousands of years, how they connect us to a greater power, how they inspire creativity and vision, how they help us to remember this sort of divine realization of the self and how we are connected to something way greater than we can ever articulate or imagine. And how can that be combined with scientific methodologies? Because we know in the 60s about the counterculture with LSD, many are not as familiar with the fact that there were over 1,000 papers published about the clinical efficacy of LSD for addiction, anxiety, depression, and a number of other indications. And so this third wave offers an opportunity to both continue to explore consciousness with a scientific mind, but also remember that as ancient medicines, these have been useful and utilized for a time period that existed way before scientificism or the sort of scientific method and industrialism.
Yeah, and there's a portion of your book that particularly fascinates me. Coming from the geopolitical, deep political perspective and historical. I want to read another slightly lengthy quote from your book where you write, quote, "During his experience, Stewart Brand, I believe, realized that NASA had yet to release satellite images of Earth from space. He believed that seeing photos of the whole Earth would change the way people thought about and treated Mother Nature. He petitioned the federal government to release a photo of the Earth from space, and he secured hundreds of thousands of signatures for the petition. After several years of foot dragging, the government finally released a photo. That image impacted society so powerfully that it inspired the first Earth Day." If I'm not mistaken, was that 1972 or somewhere back then? Okay. Mm-hmm. And this became an annual celebration that continues to bring awareness to the importance of caring for our ecosystem. Similarly, the use of LSD in Palo Alto at Stanford University inspired the computer revolution. When early computer pioneers came out of their LSD experiences, they wanted to create technology that could better enable connection and communication between people. Two of the most resonant examples of this are Douglas Engelbart, who invented both the computer interface and the computer mouse, talked about how LSD influenced his work. Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, claimed LSD use as one of the three most important, impactful, and profound experiences in his life. Later in your book, you write, arguably, LSD played a vital role in developing the personal computer, end quote. So that's absolutely fascinating and somewhat new to me. And so, psychedelics are apparently related to space exploration or cybernetics, which also brings the world together. If you could tell us a bit more about that.
So this is what Toffler was talking about in the third wave, when he was talking about how the second wave being the industrial age and the third wave being the information age, that the limiting factor no longer is our capacity to physically manufacture things. Our limiting factor is actually the capacity to spread information. And we're now sort of reaching the zenith of that with the AI revolution currently, where you have companies like NVIDIA that have incredibly high market caps because of their capacity to create semiconductors that essentially make the transmission of information way more capable. And so the book, if folks really want to do a deeper dive on this, there's a Stanford professor, Fred Turner, who wrote a book, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, that tracks the story of Stewart Brand. So what's interesting about Stewart Brand, I think focusing on him as a character is essential in this, is he was part of the Merry Pranksters. And the Merry Pranksters were a group of West Coast mavericks led by the famous author Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And Ken was involved in the early research at Stanford, at Palo Alto, with LSD and MKUltra, which was a secret CIA initiative to test the mind-controlling potential of LSD. So Ken participates in these MKUltra trials at Stanford. He sneaks LSD out of the laboratory at Stanford and starts throwing these massive parties called the acid tests with the Grateful Dead. Now, Stewart Brand is part of that crew, right? He's had a couple early LSD experiences himself, but at some point, the Ken Kesey thing gets a little old for Stewart. He wants to take on a little bit more responsibility. He's not as interested in the intentional commune life. You know, when LSD became illegal in 1966, a lot of the Ken Kesey and Merry Pranksters folks moved up to Oregon, where a lot of the hippies went from San Francisco. And so in the late 60s, early 70s is when the computer revolution kicked off. And so there's actually an article that was published in Rolling Stone, where published by Stewart Brand. And the opening line of this article, I believe it was published in 1972, is that the personal computer is the new LSD. And so when LSD became illegal in 1966 and then 1968 federally, the energy that had been, I would say, opened up through that early experimentation by folks like Steve Jobs and Douglas Engelbart and Ken Kesey and even Bill Gates, a lot of that started to be channeled towards how can we actually create technology that allows us to instantly connect with others whenever and however we want. Because when you are, as maybe some of your listeners are aware of or have felt themselves, when you take a psychedelic, there is this feeling of being interconnected, right? That is one of the most common subjective experiences of a high dose of psychedelic. I feel connected to the earth. I feel connected to my community. I feel connected to my partner, maybe who I am with. There is a deep sense of the ego dropping away, the ego being our personality, you know, our way in the world that sort of is our individual self. That tends to drop away, and we feel this sense of what's described as oceanic boundlessness, right? And then when we come back from the experience, we get back in our bodies, we get back into our more limited consciousness. We ask, how could I maybe have that experience? What technology could facilitate that experience that's not a drug, but actually something that I could physically build? And so this is how personal computers came out of it. And kind of final note that I'll end on, in 2006, Steve Jobs gave a very famous commencement speech at Stanford, which I'm sure many of your listeners know about. He talked about how you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect the dots looking backward. You should follow your heart, follow your purpose. And what he talked about, the last thing he referred to in that speech was a book that was written called The Whole Earth Catalog. And the Whole Earth Catalog was this sort of Wikipedia of its day. It was Google before Google in physical form. And that was invented by Stewart Brand. And so the most influential person in Steve Jobs' life, from my opinion, was Stewart Brand. And the most influential human in the development of the personal computer revolution was Steve Jobs. And Stewart Brand was, as I've mentioned so extensively, heavily influenced in a lot of his early work by LSD in particular. And Stewart Brand is still alive. He's in his mid-80s now. There's a phenomenal documentary about his life called We Are as Gods, because he used to have a quote that he put on the back of every Whole Earth catalog that was, "We are as gods, so we might as well get good at it." And I think it so properly encapsulates the experience that so many people have when they're on a psychedelic, is they tap into something greater than themselves. Many people would call it the divine. And it ends up dramatically changing who they are and what they choose to do in life as a result of that.
You're giving us a lot of, for me, new material so I'll be digging into Stewart Brand and a lot of this stuff is fascinating. And then to turn to the health aspect now, from my understand you're talking about microdosing, not the heavy dose of stuff. And in your book, you write, quote, by choosing to be open to experimentation, the older generation is experiencing something extraordinary. They're noting that microdosing gives them energy, improves cognitive function, sparks a long-lost sense of vitality, full of the beauty and joy that tends to dissipate as one grows older. It helps them to remain curious and open rather than stuck in their ways. In a way, microdosing helps them stay connected to the awe of life. You also talk about how microdosing can help people with traumatic brain injuries, activate new connections in the brain, and so forth. And so when it comes, practically with this third wave now that you're talking about and microdosing, what are some of the health benefits, impacts, and so forth?
Yeah, so microdosing started to become a thing about 10 years ago. In 2015, Rolling Stone and Wired published featured pieces about microdosing. Before that point in time, almost all of the research and a lot of the conversation had been around high psychedelic. So when we start to think about microdosing, one of the things that comes up is how can this be physiologically helpful? So I almost look at microdosing like a vitamin or a supplement, right? Just like taking creatine consistently or fish oil or vitamin D is going to be physiologically healthy. What microdosing does to the brain seems to have positive physiological benefits. There are 3 in particular that clinical research has found to be the case with microdosing. People have a better mood, they have more energy, and they get better sleep. So those are the 3 most common benefits: better mood, more energy, better sleep. And if I could sort of further focus that on one mechanism of action. So why is that happening? Psychedelics, the word psychedelic, psyche and delos, psyche meaning mind, delos meaning manifesting. That is the original term. These are mind manifesting substances. However, the classic scientific term for psychedelics are serotonergic agonists. Serotonergic agonists, meaning they upregulate serotonin, particularly through something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the receptor that is most responsible for the function of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is a part of our brain that helps us to make decisions. It helps us to communicate. It helps us to learn and adapt. And what scientists have noticed is when that 5-HT2A receptor gets hit, when serotonin is upregulated through that receptor, there appears to be a relationship between that and the production of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. And so a lot of the reason people are seeing a better mood, they're seeing more energy, they're seeing even better sleep, is that serotonin is upregulated. Serotonin is the feel-good molecule, right? The feel-good molecule. It gets upregulated. All of a sudden, these neurons that have maybe died away, especially if someone has TBI or other brain injuries, those start to get reactivated and turned back on. So the 2 hemispheres of the brain are starting to communicate better, which leads to a better mood, which leads to more energy. And then as someone is starting to notice, oh, I have a better mood, I have more energy, they're more likely to go for walks. They're more likely to exercise. They're more likely to eat healthier and take better care of themselves. And so there tends to be this compounding interest with microdosing, because the key with microdosing is that it's not just taking a very low dose of a psychedelic once or twice and expecting everything to be different. It really is, how are you doing this 2 or 3 times per week for at least 4 weeks? That's the minimum. I would say as long as 6 to 8 weeks, and noticing the compounding benefits over that period of time. And so just like with mindfulness meditation, clinical research has shown that if you meditate every day for 6 weeks, it develops more cortical plasticity or gray matter in the brain. Microdosing has a very similar impact, that when you're microdosing 2 or 3 times a week for a period of 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, people notice, wow, my mood's way better, I have more energy, and I'm getting better sleep overall.
You also mentioned in your book, James Fadiman, you say you cannot stress enough the importance of his decades-long ripple of influence through the field of psychedelics, and he's known as the godfather of microdosing.
Yeah, so Jim, funny to come back to this, Jim was the one who guided Stewart Brand on his experience. So when Stewart had that experience with LSD, where he had the idea of getting the full picture of Earth, Jim was the individual who gave Stewart that LSD. Jim's a psychologist. He also led the first and one of the only research trials in LSD for creativity and problem solving. This was in 1966 in Menlo Park. And he brought in a number of engineers and product managers and architects and inventors and asked them to come into that research trial with a problem they had been stuck on for at least 3 months. And something like 90% of the people who came in were able to solve that problem through the intentional LSD experience. Now, when LSD became illegal in 1966 in the state of California, Jim stopped all of that research because it was illegal. But he was continuing to support, he was continuing to explore. And in 2011, he published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And in that book, he dedicated a full chapter to the topic of microdosing. And from that full chapter, he was able to get a spot on Tim Ferriss's podcast in 2015. And after he went on Tim Ferriss's podcast, that's when Wired covered microdosing. That's when Rolling Stone covered microdosing. That's when we started to see the trend happen of all these people in Silicon Valley exploring low doses of psychedelics. So Jim is an OG. He's still alive. He's in his mid 80s today. He's definitely an OG. His first experience with psychedelics ever was with Ram Dass, who at the time was called Richard Alpert, in Paris, in I believe 1962. And I give Jim a lot of the credit for helping to pioneer this and usher microdosing into the overall conversation around mental health and performance and broadly psychedelics.
Yeah, some other interesting parts of your book. You're talking about that you can't just take this stuff. You have to set intentions. You're right. Quote, Timothy Leary based set and setting in his observations of indigenous psychedelic use. Almost all indigenous uses through ritual psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, meaning they don't have inherent values themselves, but they work as a microscope for what's already going on inside your psyche. You also talk about how people are using it today, particularly Silicon Valley, as you've been discussing cybernetics and where a lot of this came out of from, productivity, flow states, and so forth. So any comments on that?
So intention is really critical. And this is, I'd say, particularly true for high doses of psychedelics. That what they tend to do is they, again, open that window of neuroplasticity. It's also called a critical learning period. And so when you commit to going through with a psychedelic experience, you want to have a sense of where you're going to direct that energy, right? What intention might you set for that experience? And so the phrase set and setting refers to mindset. What is your mindset going into the experience? What I always recommend folks do is spend some time in meditation, spend time off, divisive media or violent media, spend time in nature, going for walks, maybe practice some yoga, right? Just sort of start to detox, especially nowadays, your overall field, so you can go into that experience with a little bit of a quieter mind. So the first thing is mindset, preparing the mindset going in. And the second main thing is setting. What's the physical environment that you're taking a psychedelic in? There are a lot of people who, in college or going to music festivals in their teens or 20s, randomly took a bunch of mushrooms or randomly took LSD, and they'll say, oh, I'd never want to do that again because it was such a bad trip. That's when the setting is wrong. And so the setting, the physical place you do it is really important. It should be somewhere quiet, should be somewhere where you can, put on headphones or music, maybe have a park nearby or wilderness to walk through, You may have a friend or lover who is there with you to support you as part of that experience. So that set and setting aspect really ensures that the experience is productive more than anything. And it may not be easy, because the thing is, especially with high doses of psychedelics, we're opening aspects of our psyche that we, for one reason or another, have kept bottled up or have ignored. Aldous Huxley referred to it as we're opening the doors of perception, right? That our normal waking consciousness is like an iceberg, that we only really see the tip of the iceberg in our normal waking consciousness. But when we start to open that vortex, we notice the subconscious and the unconscious, a lot of the memories, narratives, emotions that we've stored under the surface, those can rise back up. And so we need a space where we feel safe, because when we feel safe, we can surrender and allow ourselves to process those things. Now, microdosing is a little bit different, because microdosing isn't nearly as intense. And so typically what I tell folks is start low and go slow. You can always take more. You can't necessarily do less. And have an intention for those 30 days, right? Looking at microdosing not as a magic pill. If I take this, it'll fix my problems, but really recognizing that it's just making you more capable of change. It's making you more capable of making intentional choices. And so what I advise the clients that I work with and the practitioners that I train as well is look at microdosing as a catalyst for neuroplasticity and commit to a new practice or new behavior. It could be, I'm going to utilize microdosing to establish, a more consistent meditation practice, to maybe have difficult conversations with my partner or spouse or loved one. I'm going to look at how it could help me go to the gym more often and get physically more fit and healthy. Or I'm going to look at how it can help me to be more mindful of the food that I'm eating and what I'm consuming. So it's really important to have a clear intention, where if you're going to start to microdose and you could shift one thing about your life that would have a lot of positive downstream effects, how could you utilize microdosing as a tool, as a skill set to make that change?
You brought up Huxley, and something that came to mind for me, another part of your book, you say that in the East, the divine mushroom of immortality known as soma is described in several iconic ancient Indian texts. And of course, in Huxley's Brave New World, he talks about soma. And, on the podcast, I talk a lot about utopia and dystopia, and how, in many ways, we are heading in a dystopian direction in the world, or some are trying to push us in that direction. And I'm just wondering on the dystopia element, when it comes to whether it's, psychedelics, microdosing, if drugs can be used to manipulate us or control society, akin to the way that's described in the Brave New World. And any thoughts on this struggle with what you're talking about, microdosing and psychedelics, and whether governments might want to use it for manipulation?
A great question. So I briefly referred to this earlier with a project called MKUltra, which the CIA carried out in the 60s. And there's a fantastic docuseries on Netflix about this called Wormwood, if anyone wants to go into it. And essentially, they were exploring LSD as a mind control tool. The Nazis also used mescaline as a tool to see if they could facilitate mind control. And they were doing experiments in a lot of the concentration camps during World War II. The common thread usually between specifically psychedelics and unethical practices and behaviors is there's no consent for taking the substance, right? And so consent, willful choice, knowing precisely what one is getting into is essential to the overall benefits that I talk about. I think there's also a few other things to note, right? The United States government is already utilizing drugs. We can see this in the oligarchy that we live within, where specifically big pharmaceutical companies have bought out the FDA and the scientific process. And so I think the hope that psychedelics offers to actually get us out of that paradigm, because Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, benzodiazepines, mood stabilizers, all of these psychiatric medications are highly addictive. They have not great side effects. And long-term research shows they're really, in most cases, no more effective than placebo. Whereas with psychedelics, a lot of these are plant medicines, mushrooms, and as an example, on Third Wave, we have a grow kit where you can grow your own mushrooms. They're accessible to anyone and everyone. They're incredibly inexpensive. People can grow their own medicine. I truly believe that psychedelics are much more of a way to take our health sovereignty, right? And that we're choosing to use or to get it locally from a neighbor or someone that we know, rather than having to go through big pharmaceutical companies to get access to a drug that may or may not work. And I think the final note that I'll add on is we will use drugs no matter what. We have a biological inclination to alter our consciousness, right? The most common drugs are alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, all of which supported the growth of industrialism. And so coming back to these three waves, the agriculture, the industrial, and the information age, we entered the information age as a result of taking LSD, is my argument. And I think the drugs of the information age are much different than the drugs of the industrial age. And I, from clinical research, from my own personal experiences and the people that I've worked with, I think psychedelics offer a lot of benefits. There are some risks, of course, but they offer a lot of benefits. They are anti-addictive. They help with neuroplasticity. They, for many people, catalyze spiritual experiences that are very beneficial. And if working with them, consent must be a part of that equation. I think that is fundamental and essential to their overall benefits as well.
And when it comes to the legal aspect, I'm here in Mexico. I read from time to time news reports saying there's a push. As you've mentioned, it's been used historically here, part of the culture, but there's a push now to make it more legal in places like Mexico, and in other countries around the world. And in your book, you do mention, depending on your jurisdiction, to exercise caution when sourcing some of this material. You talk about crypto and anonymity as one thing to think about. But what's the trend when it comes to countries legalizing the use?
So Netherlands has legal psilocybin truffles. Jamaica has legal psilocybin mushrooms. There are a lot of Central American and South American states that have either decriminalized a lot of these plant medicines like mushrooms and ayahuasca, or even legalized them. Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru have all legalized ayahuasca, so you can work with it there. And then I think most interestingly for this audience, Colorado has legalized natural medicines. So psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, iboga, San Pedro, these are legal in the state of Colorado now, and Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushrooms. You can go to Oregon and also legally work with psilocybin mushrooms. And the legal landscape will look similar to cannabis. I would imagine that you'll see states legalize psychedelics first and lead the way, while the federal government continues to drag their toes and drag their feet. And the next state that will likely legalize psychedelics will be Massachusetts. They have a ballot initiative on the upcoming November ballot. And with the current polling, it looks like that will easily pass in the state of Massachusetts. So more and more accessibility every day. It still is going slow, but within, I would say, 5 to 7 years, I would estimate that the majority of Americans will have legal access to psychedelic substances.
And the spiritual dimension, a bit more, if you could expand, I think you're right that in ancient Greece, Kaikion was likely only available in private circles of elite society. You mentioned that earlier. Every year, people gather in Elis, a town
Eleusinian mysteries,
right, about 20 miles outside of Athens, to engage in secret ritualistic ceremonies known as the Eleusinian mysteries. And I use the term very broadly. The New Age today, a lot of the conferences that I've attended, Greater Reset, Anarchapulco, and others, it seems by and large, most of the folks are into the different elements, right? Psychedelics, or again, I use very broadly the term New Age. You also talk about oneness. If you could sort of expand upon that, and consciousness. You talk about Paul Stamets. Back in the day, I used to take Stamets mushroom supplements, but people talk about raising your consciousness or global consciousness, and I still don't really know what they're referring to or what that means. And so, thoughts on this sort of ambient today?
So, yeah, this is a great question. So it goes back to this feeling of interconnectedness, right? A lot of what industrialism has been built off of is this belief that we are separate from our external environment. I occupy an individual self. You occupy an individual self. A plant occupies an individual self. And our consciousnesses are all separate. They're all different, right? And this is sort of the basis of Newtonian physics. This is the basis of physicalism or reductionism from a philosophical perspective. Oftentimes, when people take psychedelics, their worldview, their metaphysic, tends to change into more of what's called a panpsychic orientation, where they see consciousness is emergent in everything. And so all of a sudden, plants have consciousness, mushrooms have consciousness, animals have consciousness, we as humans have consciousness. And this is much more in line with indigenous ways of knowing. And so part of what's happening with the reemergence of people working with psychedelics is there is a retrieval of indigenous wisdom, which is essential, in my opinion, for environmental regeneration, because we cannot take care of something that we believe is separate from ourselves. We can only start to really love and take care of something if we see it as directly connected to our own well-being as a human species. And psychedelics, more than anything, especially at a high dose, that experience facilitates an opening where we feel deeply connected to everything around us. And so when we talk about that higher consciousness, that is what it's referring to in particular, is that feeling of interconnectedness. And this is what almost every ancient religious mystical tradition has talked about, from the Quakers in the Christian tradition, to the Kabbalists in the Jewish tradition, to the Sufis in the Islam tradition, to the Vedantas in the Hindu tradition, to Buddhists generally, because the Buddhists are just tapped in like that. They talk about this experience of oneness, of connection, of relationship with source, with something greater. The Vedantas talk about it in terms of the higher self. Right. And the most common experience for individuals after a high dose of a psychedelic is that experience. Right. And so we see this written about as soma in the ancient Vedic scriptures, the Kukion brew in the ancient Eleusinian mysteries. They all talk about how it facilitates something called ego death or ego dissolution. That even on the Eleusinian mysteries where it was hosted, there was an inscription on that thing, which was to die before you die, so you do not die when you die. So that experience of ego death, that experience of ego dissolution, that capacity to connect with something greater than the individual self, that is the imprint of higher consciousness that I believe will inform a new understanding of how we connect to our communities, to ourselves, to the environment around us, which I'm hopeful will lead to a lot more intention that is put into environmental regeneration in particular.
In your book, you talk about how you grew up in a Christian household. You talk about how on your first acid trip, you realized that the shame and guilt were external and did not belong to me, and you didn't have to continue to live that story. And you also say the second way LSD changed me was by removing the fear of death. I guess from a Christian perspective, that kind of sounds like LSD removed your concern for, the idea of sin as well as death. And it's funny, in another part of your book, you talk about Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD. I guess the first time he went on a trip, he ended up tripping his face off while riding his bike home from the office in a nightmarish hallucination, imagining himself chased by demons. And so, any thoughts on the Christian perspective? And the Bible warns against sort of getting drunk or opening
intoxication,
you up, right? And how this can open you up to, I guess, the other realm and demons and that sort of thing?
Yeah, the book that Huxley published about his experience had two parts. The first part was The Doors of Perception, which I talked about. The second part was called Heaven and Hell, because Huxley realized that by taking these psychedelics, we could open these states of either bliss, joy, transcendence, and awe, or absolute hellish nightmares of devils and demons, right? And I think my take on it is that all of these are within us. So sometimes we think of entities, or we think of devils, or we think of whatever is external to us. And my perspective would be the universe lives within each one of us. And so when we take a psychedelic, it's opening up our consciousness in such a way where we start to experience, as Carl Jung talked about, the collective unconscious that is within us. And so these archetypes and these stories start to come forward that are ancient, that are transpersonal, that go beyond our individual lineage. And so I think the reason psychedelics were prohibited in the first place is because the Christian church recognized that they could open people up in such a way where the priests of the Christian church would no longer be seen as useful. Because why would I go through a priest to talk to God if I can take a psychedelic to actually have the direct experience of God? And so I do think we are now entering this interesting phase where more and more people are leaving the church. More and more people are leaving mainstream religion. A lot of people are entering this liminal phase where they don't know what to believe. And I think a lot of people are coming into psychedelics to reactivate some level of spiritual depth and understanding. I think the risk with that is it is a bit of a new age soup at this point in time. The upside to traditions like Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or any of the really mainstream religions is they have lineage and tradition that is passed down for thousands and thousands of years. And that ritual that's been established is actually really helpful to sort of keep the bus going down. Basically, when you start to take off some of that structure, that's when people can lose their shit. And so I think the downside to a lot of the interest in psychedelics and more people utilizing it is we haven't really created these new structures yet, right? The most prescient model or example was in ancient Greece. They would have cults, right? Like the cult of Isis or the cult of Dionysus or the cult of whoever. And I think what we need to figure out is how do we, first of all, strip away the stigma of cults, because there is a very obviously negative connotation with modern cults. But more importantly, what is it like to build ethical cults? And how can we sort of redefine the way that community comes together, the way that people live, and not necessarily keep people in fear, but instead allow them to expand and access the full range of what it means to be human and still be in community and accountability within that. Because I think that's also what mainstream religion and the church does really well. Is I remember back in the day when I was very skeptical of Christianity, I was like, why do parents always go to church anyway? And I came to realize, it's because that's where all their friends are. And that's where all their community is. And so I think there's also this element of the church is the community. And we're looking for that new space for people who no longer believe in a lot of the dogma that has been so relevant the last, couple thousand years, specifically with Christianity.
We've covered a lot. Is there any other theme that I haven't broached? Any other things you think are important?
No, this is fantastic. It was practical. I got to wax a little bit about topics that I don't normally get to talk as much about. So I was pretty excited when I saw the topic of this podcast being geopolitics and empire, because this is the stuff that I really nerd out on. I would say if folks are curious, if they want to go deeper, just go to thethirdwave.co or just type in third wave microdosing or Paul Austin microdosing. I'm on social, on Twitter and Instagram, Paul Austin 3W. And if folks are interested, we have a training program for coaches and practitioners. They can find out more details about that on Third Wave. And we also have our own podcast that I've hosted for 8 or 9 years now. We've published almost 260 episodes. And so if you are curious about psychedelics and you want to get a little bit more familiar, go to the Psychedelic podcast and you can check out more details there.